Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so I am going to move at some speed through this because with only 20 minutes, we had a lot of really rich data out of this project, and I want to, thank you, try and cover some of the key highlights. You'll probably recognize the image on the cover slide there from the very recent far-right extremist demonstrations in Karawa. Okay, so look, the background and the context for this is that we identified about 2 years ago a gap in the national CVE landscape. When you think about CVE over the last 20 years or so, it has been almost entirely informed by both assumptions and data that derive from metropolitan settings, okay? So we have thought about countering violent extremism and terrorism as something that we need to do in cities. And there have been some good reasons for that. So, over the last 20 years, when you think about what the threats and risks have been, often based on some pretty reliable data, they have actually emanated out of metropolitan settings. And alongside of that has then gone a range of assumptions and reliances on certain kinds of infrastructure, certain kinds of resources, and certain kinds of systems, all of which have been readily available in these urban, dense, concentrated settings. They also have tended to focus on engagement, with specific bounded communities. And here I am talking primarily historically about Muslim communities who lived in particular geographic concentrations. So as we've heard from Noemi this morning, that focus on place was very, very much a part of a lot of the engagement strategies and also a lot of the investment and resource strategies that we saw during this period. But the more recent emergence and escalation of far-right extremist mobilization that we've now seen over the last 2 years in particular has really changed quite significantly the flow and the pattern of far-right extremist efforts. And this is particularly in the context of things like recruitment and mobilization, something that Mike Burgess has focused on repeatedly over a number of the recent ASIO threat assessments. And then, of course, I'm not going to dwell on this, but, we all know the reasons why and some of the supporting environmental factors, the rise of Donald Trump, things that happened during COVID, and enhanced opportunities around both online and offline exposure to far-right extremist commentary, analysis, and narratives has sort of fueled some of this. I am just noticing, actually, Matteo, that the more updated version of my slides hasn't been uploaded, but that's okay. I'll cope. I'll cope. Okay, so we have seen increasing far-right activity in rural and regional areas. There has been a shift in the locations and ways in which radicalization is taking place. In some of these places, for example, Albury, which is one of our study sites, there have been some known and documented cases that have reached court, such as Tyler Jakovich and Jared Serby, and that's influenced community knowledge and perspectives in those locations. Of course, Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch terrorist, came from Grafton in New South Wales, country town, and we've seen a whole range of activity in places like Ballarat, Bendigo, Grampians, recently Korowa, that are performative, designed to maximize profile and media coverage, but also combat and weapons training going on in rural and regional areas. Wiambilla was a very tragic reminder also of the ways in which radicalization in remote areas can thrive on both social and geographical isolation, and the lack of observed indicators and warning signs relative to more urban or populated settings. So when we set up this study, we wanted to understand, a bit similar to what Noemi was saying. She said she doesn't focus on the canary, she focuses on the mine. My focus for a long time has been on the other birds in the environment, those who are around the canaries, yes, and the ways that we can mobilize local community actors around people who may be vulnerable or susceptible or at risk of radicalizing in these local settings. So we wanted to know how these communities understood radicalization and extremism, what their awareness was around particular ideologies, and we did have a focus on far-right extremism, the challenges they thought these things posed, what they felt their capacity was to identify and respond to concerns, and what existing resources and capabilities were already in place in local, regional and rural communities that might help us understand what existing assets were, but also what gaps in CVE community might actually exist out in the regions. We also did some specific work on youth perspectives, which I cannot talk to you about today because the data was too rich to allow me to do justice to it in the time involved. So stay tuned for something else on that at some point in the future. Very briefly, 41 participants, 8 field sites across 3 different states, those states being New South Wales, South Australia, and Queensland. You can see the distribution of the field sites there. We had people from local government and local shires, law enforcement, social service providers, local community leaders, and also just ordinary local community members, and then young people participating both in some of the interviews, but also in some specific focus groups that were dealing with youth-specific issues. So very briefly, how did people in local, regional, or rural communities that we went into understand radicalization and violent extremism? So those of you from government who do a lot of work on defining these things will be delighted to hear that many people in rural and regional areas think of radicalization as a process and involving the transformation or formation of a belief set, conversion to an extreme cause or ideology, political ideas, both on the left and the right. They also thought of radicalization, in some cases, as a precursor to violent extremism. A number of people were very alert to the contextual nature of radicalization as a concept, noting that its meaning and definition could change depending on who was using it and for what purpose. There was also another group of people across these field sites who saw radicalization as more closely aligned to ideas about recruitment and indoctrination. So they placed less emphasis on the agency of people in radicalizing and more emphasis on those who were intentionally trying to lead them in particular directions. In terms of violent extremism, there was some variation on issues around causation. So some people thought that violence was almost the inevitable outcome or endpoint of extreme or radical views, taking one's beliefs too far when somebody has extreme views that result in them acting in a violent way. Others distinguished structurally between the use of violence specifically for intimidation and the systematic violent targeting of outgroups versus what they called more casual or everyday forms of hatred and hostility. And I thought this quote from somebody in the Coffs Harbour Grafton region really summed it up. Violent extremism is the really high end of hate in the community, and it's very hard to disagree with that. But most of all, I think the important point was that for almost all the participants, violence was the crucial dividing line in distinguishing violent extremism either from extremism itself or indeed from radicalization as a process. So in that sense, there is a high knowledge level that accords basically with the field and with, to the extent that we have a consensus in the field around the definition of these terms. When it comes to levels of awareness around radicalization and violent extremism, this was done on a Likert scale. You can see the results here. Overwhelmingly, people said they thought local levels of awareness in their community about radicalization and VE were low. Yeah, this excludes the young people in the focus group responses. So why was it low? This included radicalization and violent extremism just not being on the radar in these local communities. People thinking, look, frontline workers and first responders tend to know a little bit more, but ordinary people in communities, this is not really an area of focus for them. A lot of people said there was widespread complacency that things like radicalization to violence happen somewhere else. That somewhere else being big cities, other countries, right? Not in small country towns, not in medium-sized regional areas. There was also quite a common tendency to say that even where there were concerns, they were likely to be swept under the carpet to avoid damaging local relationships. This is a key point of distinction in these communities. If you have a concern about you're a school teacher in a rural community, you have a concern about a young fella in one of your classes, and you want to share that concern, but actually he's the son of the local copper, right, in your community. Who are you going to turn to? What's the impact of your relationship with other parents, with the local police, with a range of other providers going to be? It's a completely different social dynamic, and that is a very important thing, to understand. The other point that was raised by people was that the Overton window for what might be considered extreme or radical in far-right terms might not be that far from normative views held by the general population. This quote, if you had those beliefs yourself, you wouldn't necessarily point that person out as being radical because you'd say, well, chip off the old block, good on you, son. That's what I think too. In terms of actually, I had skipped this slide in the updated version, so I'm going to go right over it now. When we think about explanatory factors for vulnerability to far-right radicalization in rural regional areas, pre-existing social and cultural attitudes, which we've already touched on, backlash against social change. So this is basically an argument that says, the imposition of sort of progressive, quote unquote, woke views, is producing a backlash where people are saying, well, this used to be right with me, and now you're telling me that it's wrong and that I'm wrong, and I don't like being told that I am wrong, that I have a wrong identity. Certainly local social and economic vulnerability, including, of course, post-COVID, feeling that people who'd experienced acute difficulties around job, other economic losses, but also damage to social relationships in those local communities, particularly around the split between vaccination and anti-vaccination movements and populations. The idea of moving between extreme beliefs and ideology. So a lot of people were very acute about the idea that those with extreme views, the grievances, the target grievances might fluctuate. And they said, look, what that told them was that the beliefs themselves they didn't think were as important as other aspects, for example, social connectedness within an extremist setting, or the joint experience of things like polycrises, bunches of crises, piling up at the same time. So for many people in rural and regional communities that we spoke to, they framed radicalization as basically developing around personal vulnerabilities, educational deficits, family breakdown and family violence, mental health issues, and then broader social and economic challenges and problems. But there were also a range of protective factors that people pointed to. These are key ones: a really strong sense of local support networks and connectedness. So what somebody in another study of ours called known faces in known places, support from local government, clubs, charities, sporting organizations, religious and civic schools, really pervasive sense that the local community would support people who were struggling with challenges and would have your back. Further south in the country and the field sites, people talked about, increased sense of ethnic and racial and cultural diversity and accepting that. But they also said this is a bit of a generational divide. Young people are more likely to be accepting rather than older people. And frankly, the further north we went, the less prominent that view around acceptance was. People also felt that it was protective in that there was going to be a capacity for quicker identification and uptake of responses if they did have concerns about somebody who might be radicalizing to violence. So, you can't be anonymous, this person said, in a small community. People are aware of red flags and vulnerabilities. They're going to be identified pretty swiftly as opposed to a metro area. Good relationships with law enforcement was also seen as a protective factor in some communities. And interestingly, positive responses to other social change campaigns. So people said, look, we used to have reporting on domestic violence was a no-no, right? People didn't talk about domestic violence, and when they did, they called it something else. But there was a really big take-up of, response to social change campaigns around that. They said, if we could do it with domestic violence, why can't we do it with violent extremism? In terms of vulnerabilities, and what I've done here, 5 minutes, thanks. What I've done here is try to outline in red some of the things that are quite specific to rural regional areas, whereas the ones not in red have more in common also with metro areas. So there were big issues with access to geographical and timely access to services, especially for remote communities. plus reluctance to approach services who are dealing with, difficult or stigmatizing topics, a rise in school and community disengagement, but that is actually uncommon post-COVID with metropolitan settings. Difficulty identifying risky behaviors and red flags. So weapons acquisition or stockpiling, buying things like fertilizer and diesel, firearms training, hunting. These are all normative in rural and regional communities. They're not necessarily going to raise flags the way that it would if somebody comes home with a ton of fertilizer in the city and they've only got a concrete backyard. Right? So how do you read the signals, right? How do you contextualize what you're seeing? A very important point, I thought, was the idea of competition around awareness of violent extremism and radicalization with bigger priorities in rural regional areas. People said, we've got big mental health challenges out here. We have big concerns with domestic violence. Those are the hot ticket items. Violent extremism is somewhere down there, somewhere down the list, right? We need to focus, more on these more pervasive issues. And then transport challenges. So people said, I live in an area where the bus only runs 2 times a day. How do I get to the counselor? How do I get to the social service? I lost my job. I live on benefits. I can't afford to maintain my car anymore and do the 2-hour drive, in and out of the regional hub. So that transport piece was really key. Now, I know that as I said, these are the unmodified slides. So I'm going to zoom and go right to the end in my concluding thoughts. Okay, so some of the key findings that emerged as particularly salient out of the study for regional rural communities compared to urban counterparts included the following. As we saw, clear evidence of social connectedness, familiarity, intimacy, and support in these networks. This is an enormous protective factor that can absolutely be harnessed. Heightened sensitivity in picking up early behavioral or indeed attitudinal changes or anomalies linked to violent radicalization, but that is a bit offset by the idea of the sort of more normative space in which particular ideas might not actually raise some flags. A really key point coming next, when it comes to sharing or reporting concerns, an outsider channel or service may be safer or indeed more desirable for some people. So if I have to report on somebody to authorities who I think really is showing some very troubling signs of going in the wrong direction, in an urban setting, I'm going to want to talk to somebody familiar, somebody that I know, a recognizable service. It does not work that way in rural regional areas. They need somebody not connected to them to feel safe, and that's a key finding. Local councils, this was fascinating to us. In urban metropolitan settings in our big cities, it is state and territory jurisdictions and the Commonwealth. And local government has, local government has a very small role to play, relatively speaking. But local government in the form of councils and shires and regional and rural areas is huge. People are very positive about them. They deliver a huge number of resources and services. They are key players for rural regional CVE and need to be mobilized as such. Geosocial isolation plays out differently in rural regional communities compared to urban settings. This includes recognizing, as we've just seen, some of the unique challenges around transport service accessibility and also digital access and coverage. We drive people towards online resources, but if you've got crappy 4G and a pardon my language, a shit satellite, out there, how are you going to access those resources? So that is something that I think not too many people are thinking about. And in that context, what people said was, in many communities, they wanted retro resources, letterboxing, community notice boards, radio. And ironically, this is what far-right extremist groups also do when they're out recruiting and attempting to mobilize. And so the suggestion was, well, we need to use similar methods, not get rid of online communication, but alongside it. So I think that the findings from the studies demonstrate that the protections, vulnerabilities, and resources that we've identified in rural regional communities in these field sites have shown a rich and complex set of both capabilities and needs that can augment and expand our CVE capacity. They are primed to respond to some of the changing and evolving dynamics that we see, but they have been underattended, and we haven't really considered. So the change that we need to see, the shift in response that we need to make is to say, alongside alongside all the knowledge that we've accumulated over the last 20 years about CVE based on our understanding of what happens in cities, what does it look like out in regional and country areas? What assets can we take advantage of? And what gaps do we still need to address? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michele. Insightful presentation. I now invite the next presenter, Aaron Thomas Calbert. Presentation is titled A New Wave of Violent Extremists Using PIRUS to Analyze Shifts in Terrorists, Demography, Ideology, Operation, and Victims.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll have to forgive me when... Oh. Yes. Yep.
That's the next one. Yes, that one.
Ladies and gentlemen, you'll have to forgive me. When it comes to technology, I'm like a reverse King Midas. Everything I touch turns to trash. But that small matter notwithstanding, my principal supervisor, Dr. Djordje Stefanovic, and myself will be presenting the preliminary results of our analysis of PIRUS, Profiles of Individual Radicalization in the United States. And I am Aaron Thomas Calbert. I am a first-year PhD student at the University of Adelaide, so you'll forgive my rather fractured nerves. This is the first time I've actually presented at a serious international conference, and thus I'm not at the peak of my British eloquence, shall I say. Oh. Okay, for some reason it shows up there, but it's not showing up here. There we go. It's okay, I'll just, I'll cope. Anyway, violent extremists in a nutshell, what we know from the past literature. Well, consistent with past criminological studies, we know that violent extremists are mostly young males. And of further note, prior criminal records and a lack of community connection are associated with radicalization. Of further note, far-right extremists in general seem to be less educated on average than the far left. And of course, there is no universal profile of terrorist offenders, and the results that we will be presenting here will unfortunately further confirm that fact. So the knowledge gap. The majority of although a substantial portion of statistical scholarship has been developed in the last 20 years, the majority of studies seem to focus exclusively on either the far right or the far left as wholes. And limited attention seems to have been given to the systematic similarities and differences between specific ideological movements. Consequently, oh God.
Sorry.
I called it at the beginning.
Yeah. Okay. Now, if we just... Okay, I will switch it.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, you all right?
Yes, I'm good.
So as such, we shall be attempting to address the following research questions in order to address this gaps. What differences do specific ideological groups show in their demographic and socioeconomic composition? Do specific ideological groups or movements exhibit variation in their general radicalization influences? That is, the factors that influence the radicalization process. And in what ways do specific ideological groups divulge in their modus operandi? And the three groups that comprise what you could call an unholy trinity that we selected for analysis include Islamists, white supremacists, and sovereign citizens. Islamists, of course, will be familiar to everyone, and generally the literature, there is some definitional disagreement on this. They refer to radicalized Muslims who oppose the intervention of Western states in Muslim-majority countries, but again, it's a congeries of different movements, and I'll be speaking about that towards the end. White supremacists, of course, are generally extremists who believe in the superiority of those of Caucasian or Aryan descent, and sovereign citizens, an emerging threat, are anti-government activists who fundamentally reject the authority of the state, and they seek its complete abolition, basically the Wild West. And sovereign citizens have been included in this cross-comparison because few studies empirically address their demographics and criminogenic factors. Now, of course, you will recognize the Weambilla shooters Gareth and Stacey Train, who ambushed and killed police officers Rachel McCrow and Matthew Arnold in December of 2022. And they actually have links with the United States. The extremist Donald Day Jr. was arrested in connection to the Train's family, and was known to have engaged with them online for at least 2 to 3 years prior to the shooting. So there does seem to be some transnational connections between different ideological groups, although with PIRUS it is difficult to determine the exact extent of this, but we'll go into that later during question time. So our data and methods. We use the profiles of individual radicalization in the United States database, PIRUS for short, which codes for about 150 variables and 3,528 extremists who radicalized in the United States and who were either arrested, indicted, or killed due to ideological activities, or were members of a known or recognized terrorist organization. And we use multinomial logistic regression on the bivariate level to answer our research questions. And as you can see here, the green reflects this chart reflects the rate of exposure for different extremist groups. The green represents Islamists, the red represents sovereign citizens, and the yellow represents white supremacists. And as we can see, contrary to David Rappaport's, I hope I'm not mispronouncing the name, historical conception of terrorists being successive waves, we seem to be seeing multiple different ideological groups radicalizing or coming out as radicalized extremists in consecutive waves that seem to overlap, especially since 2016. Again, the causes of this are not quite clear, but we will go into that during question time. So, the preliminary results. Islamists and white supremacists are similar in terms of gender composition, over 90% male, and are generally 20 to 39 years of age on average. But conversely, sovereign citizens show a higher composition of female membership and are generally 40 to 59 years of age. And of further note, our results also reflect a couple of baffling findings. Although the majority do not seem to have military experience, our analysis reveals that Islamists are actually the likeliest, at least in the United States, to have military experience. We are baffled by this. We don't really know how to explain it. We ran the test 3 times assuming we'd made a coding mistake, but alas, it wasn't there. And it's also because Djordje also was checking it in case my technological curse came back to haunt me. And a further note, white supremacists are 3 times less likely to advance socially compared to Islamists and have a much lower level of education on average compared to both Islamists and sovereign citizens. A further note, in contrast to Islamists and white supremacists, sovereign citizens are much more likely to be self-employed. Now, PIRUS is a bit vague on the conception of what constitutes self-employment. It could mean doing odd jobs to make your own living, and because their ideology is basically the equivalent of the Wild West in an extremist context, it could be the fact that they just want to separate themselves from government authority or federal authority. And in terms of radicalization influences, the internet plays a key role across all ideological groups. Over 75% of cases across all three groups showed that the internet was involved in the process of radicalization. And of further note, all three groups show not much evidence of past mental illness, but, and again, this is baffling, Islamists have the highest rate of diagnosed mental illness. Past studies in the literature, especially studies that focus on white supremacist extremists, indicate the opposite, that white supremacists and neo-Nazis are the ones to suffer from this. Again, we're not exactly sure why. And of further note, sovereign citizens compared to Islamists have a higher likelihood of being involved with radicalized significant others, which is in contrast to both Islamists and white supremacists, who are more likely to be involved with friends or peers who have engaged in extremist violence. And of further note, Islamists, in contrast to sovereign citizens and white supremacists, are 4 times more likely to exhibit anger at the United States or to reject the legitimacy of the United States government as a whole. And our final section for our preliminary results includes differences in terms of targets and preparation. And again, they just keep getting more and more different. Islamists, in contrast to white supremacists and sovereign citizens, are 10 times likelier to target United States government institutions and staff, whereas white supremacists, in reverse, are 7.8 times likelier to target private citizens compared to Islamists and sovereign citizens. And a further note, sovereign citizens, in contrast to Islamists and white supremacists, I know this is getting a bit complicated, are the least likely to pre-plan attacks of any nature. And if anything, our results seem to indicate that they are more likely to engage in spontaneous acts of violence. And the most baffling finding that we have are that Islamists are the most likely statistically to extensively prepare for a terrorist attack. But in spite of that, they are the least likely to succeed in executing terrorist attacks, in contrast with white supremacists, who exhibit an extremely low rate of preparation, and yet in spite of this, they have the highest rate of success in executing terrorist attacks. Now, there are a number of limitations. PIRUS is cross-sectional data, meaning it's very difficult to infer causal relationships from it. Secondly, the causes of fluctuations of activity across all three ideological groups is not exactly clear. And because PIRUS is an open source database that draws on news reports and court documents, basically publicly available information, missing data is consistently noted to be an issue which requires multiple imputations. And again, Islamists, white supremacists, and sovereign citizens all have subgroups which can't necessarily be analysed due to insufficient data. Now, I personally call this the reductionist problem. And that's basically where we drill further down into the composition of these groups in terms of their subgroups. With Islamists, you've got organizations or movements as diverse as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban. And with white supremacists, again, you've got subgroups as diverse as neo-Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Confederates, the Proud Boys, and Christian identity adherents. I'll talk about that during question time. And a further note, with sovereign citizens, you've got how do we know if they're just anti-government activists or do they identify with sovereign citizen ideology? We can't tell because the data basically just fuses them together. And also, we don't know if they're just anti-law enforcement activists with a grievance against police specifically, or whether they actually genuinely identify with the sovereign citizen beliefs. So basically what the reductionist problem is that the further we drill down into the subgroups of specific movements, we lose the statistical power to gain any meaningful analysis, and therefore, as per usual, more data is required. And that is, I'm sorry to say, the usual cliche of conducting research. But alas, that is the curse that we all share. Thank you very much. Oh, bit of a boo-boo, some potential implications for CVE professionals. I will go through this very quickly with brevity. The evidence suggests that the profiles for all three groups are so distinct that they need to be disaggregated. meaning that because they're different in terms of demographics, socioeconomics, and radicalization influences, we can't necessarily treat them or counter them as if they were the same. The evidence indicates that we need to try and develop as many programs as possible that are ideologically group-centric, meaning we have programs that are specifically designed to deter or rehabilitate white supremacists, Islamists, and sovereign citizens each. And that just makes our task that much more complicated. And a further note, while the number of violent extremists since 2016 has increased for all three ideological groups, they do not form a single wave. And it would appear that the white supremacist wave has not yet peaked. A further note, and just recapping, sovereign citizens are more likely to be self-employed, older on average, have more female membership, and are better educated compared to Islamists and white supremacists. White supremacists are the least likely to move up socially and economically compared, at least with Islamists and sovereign citizens. Internet monitoring seems justified as the internet plays a key role in the radicalization process for all three groups. And a further note, Islamists and sovereign citizens are far likelier to attack government-related targets, whereas white supremacists prefer to attack civilian targets. And a further note, the regression analyses tentatively indicate the sovereign citizens are the likeliest to engage in spontaneous, unplanned violence. And a further note, white supremacists exhibiting a higher rate of success despite their inferior planning and preparation suggests tentatively that they may require additional monitoring, but we can get into that during question time. And as this is an ongoing analysis, further multivariate analysis and multiple imputations will be used to test the generalizability of these preliminary findings. And thank you very much, and for putting up with my technological blunders.
We have now Dr. Bettina Rottweiler from University College of London with a presentation titled Examining Change in Conspiracy Beliefs and Violent Extremism Over Time. Hi, Bettina, can you hear us?
Yes, can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just going to share my slides quickly. Okay, can everyone see the slides? All good? Perfect, thank you. Hi everyone, so my name's Bettina. I have actually just moved to the US. I have left UCL. I work now at the National Counterterrorism Center for Innovation, Technology and Education here in Omaha, which is a US Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence. The project I'm talking about today focuses on conspiracy theories and violent extremism, which I'm leading together with Paul Gill, who's based at UCL. We are still doing the project together. I'm just going to be based now in the US and he's in the UK. We've done 1 year on the project now. We've done also several data waves, and I'm going to show you some data later on. But really what we are trying to achieve with the project is different things. So we try to assess the prevalence of conspiracy theories, different types of conspiracy theories within the US. And we're also interested to examine their relationship with different types of violent extremism, as well as people's intentions to engage in election violence. We're also interested to measure how conspiracy beliefs and violent intentions evolve over the course of the presidential election, which is happening next week. So this is really, here we want to look at like the temporal relationship of changes in conspiracy theories at the same time as people's violent intentions. And then the third part is led by Isabel van der Wecht, who's based at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And she's looking at the relationship between language use and conspiracy beliefs. So how people are discussing and writing about conspiracy theories and also how strong their violent intentions are. So the main project method is like a 6-wave longitudinal data collection. We've decided to do a longitudinal data collection because we know that longitudinal data in the field of terrorism and violent extremism is very rare. Together with Paul, we've done around 15 cross-sectional surveys across the US, Canada, UK, and Germany. And yeah, there's only so much you can really achieve with cross-sectional surveys. So we thought we now want to invest and do longitudinal data analysis to really see if certain things changed together, what potential risk or protective factors might change at the same time. And this is really to give us some insights into the developmental trajectories. Here specifically, we look at the course of the election year, just because it's such a significant event in the US. And we're also trying to identify key risk and protective factors which might be implemented within prevention and intervention programs. And again, Isabel focuses on linguistic markers of conspiracy beliefs, so the way people talk about conspiracy beliefs, and other key outcomes, and how we can measure certain things in text. So first, the first object or aim we had was to measure the prevalence of different types of conspiracy theories and intentions to engage in election violence in the US, to get some kind of like baseline model from which we can then track changes in like increases or decreases in certain attitudes and intentions. Here's just like just need to move this over quickly. Just like an example of items, we've measured a lot more. The surveys are around 30 minutes long. We started off with 2,500 US citizens, and we asked them, for example, about election-related conspiracy beliefs. Here we asked whether they agree on a scale from 1 to 7, where 7 means I strongly agree and 1 means I strongly disagree. So, for example, we asked them, a secret group of powerful people manipulates political elections in this country to serve their own interests. And then we asked people whether they agree or disagree, and everyone answering 5, 6, or 7. So some would agree or strongly agree. We averaged, and we could see that 37.3% of people agreed with the statement. We also had like party-specific items, just because of like the polarization and the partisanship in the US. Here we had like ones tailored towards the Democratic Party and also the Republican Party. We also measured 2 very important conspiracy theories which we know have motivated violent attacks in the US, but also in Europe and New Zealand. So here we, for example, measured great replacement conspiracy theory beliefs and anti-Semitic conspiracy beliefs. And we could see that specifically the anti-Semitic conspiracy beliefs, we saw the lowest agreement levels. Sorry. Yeah, so then we were also interested to measure election legitimacy and also support, as well as intentions to engage in election violence. And here we kind of differentiated between support and intentions, because usually what we see with our data, that a lot more people say, yeah, it can be justified to engage in violence due to certain or due to political goals or aims. But when we ask people if they personally would be willing, usually we see that the numbers drop quite significantly. I mean, we can see here as well that support for election-related violence was highest with 9.9%, and then intentions to engage in election violence. Here we had the generic item, I would be willing to engage in violence if I thought the opposing political party or other powerful actors rigged the 2024 presidential election. We had actually 5.7% of people agreeing with this statement. So we were then interested just to look a bit more at the overlaps, kind of go one step further and look at the association between conspiracy beliefs. and violent extremist outcomes, as well as election violence, because we do know from previous research and from real world cases that conspiracy theories can motivate people to engage in violence. Like, obviously, there's a lot more people who do believe in conspiracy theories, and a lot of them will not have any violent intentions, but we do know that there have been motivating factors present within recent attacks. So for example, we then we divided people into those who said, yes, I do believe in the specific conspiracy theory item, and those people who said they don't believe in the conspiracy theory. And always the gray bars, you can see is the people who said, yes, I do believe in a conspiracy theory. So here it was like the generic election conspiracy belief item. And then we looked at two different types of outcomes. So we looked at generic violent extremist intentions. So here we asked people whether they would be willing to engage in different types of violent extremist behaviors, from like violent protests to like attacking politicians, and also to engaging in violence against the police. And then we also had the election violence intention, so whether they would be willing to engage in election violence if they think they would be rigged. And we could see with like both violent outcomes that those people who said, yes, I do believe in election conspiracy theory, that they were significantly more likely, around 3 times more likely, to also hold intentions to engage in violence. Interestingly, and this is actually the strongest finding we had in our data. So when we looked specifically at anti-Semitic conspiracy belief item, so that Jews have deliberately caused significant wars and crises in Western countries for their own ends, we could see that people who said, yes, I do agree with the statement, were around 4 to 5 times more likely to also say, yes, I am willing to engage in election violence. Yes, I am willing to engage in different types of violent extremist behaviors, which we found quite interesting, because before, obviously, the conspiracy theory item was closely tied or linked to the outcome. So it was a election conspiracy theory item, and it was then, would you engage in election violence? However, here it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and we still see, or we see like even a stronger effect that that those people are also significantly more likely to say, yes, I do have violent intentions. I mean, we can't say that the conspiracy theory causes here anything or leads to something. We just know that those people have higher conspiracy beliefs also tend to be significantly more likely to hold violent intentions. And a very similar result we saw for the Great Replacement conspiracy theory item, where we asked about a deliberate plot to replace white people, and we could see that around 3 to 4 times more likely, it was 3 to 4 times more likely amongst those people who said, yes, I believe in the conspiracy theory. We then went another step further, and we really wanted to look at the relevance. So when does conspiracy thinking become relevant to extremist or violent extremist risk? So because we know, okay, there's some sort of association between conspiracy beliefs and violent extremism. I've been saying that for the last 5 years, and we still don't really understand it. We know there is a relationship, and we know certain factors which overlap and could potentially cause both, but we don't really know how it all works. So what we are trying to do is like to see when and for whom conspiracy beliefs can be particularly dangerous. So because we know so many people do have conspiracy beliefs, but only, fortunately, like a small amount of people has violent intentions. So it's really kind of getting closer to those people who have conspiracy beliefs and have like other factors which makes them more likely or more vulnerable to engage in violent extremism. And it's really then those factors who potentially amplify or dampen kind of the risk effects of conspiracy beliefs, which would be like vital for like intervention and prevention programs. And for example, we had multiple ones. Here you can see self-control. So at the bottom, you can see people's election conspiracy beliefs, so their agreement levels. And on the y-axis, you can see the intentions to engage in election violence. And what we could actually see is like with the top dark blue line is that those people who have low self-control are significantly more likely to say they have intentions to engage in violent extremism. We can see that if people have high levels of self-control, that the effects are dampened. So we can say the risk effects of election conspiracy theories on intentions to engage in election violence are lessened amongst those people. So potentially strengthening self-control might be an interactive protective factor, which might help with intervention and prevention programs. We've also seen more and more in our data, especially also in qualitative data, that anger rumination plays a big role. So people have certain grievances, and rather than just having the attitude or the grievance, it's really that constant focusing on the event which angered them, kind of not being able to let go of angry thoughts and emotions about events. So we were testing people's generic tendency to engage in anger rumination. And we could see that especially those people who are high in anger rumination, again, the top blue line, are significantly more likely to engage or to say they would engage in election violence when they also have conspiracy beliefs. And again, similar to low self-control, that those people who are low in anger rumination are significantly less likely to say, I would engage in election violence. Then we also, this is like a very strong factor usually across our data sets. It's called legal cynicism. So it's really measuring people's attitudes towards law, rules, norms. And it's not tied to violent extremism, but it's like whether they think they should follow the rules and norms. And we see that this usually highly correlates with any type of antisocial, violent or criminal behavior. And we can especially see here, so like those people, if you look at the bottom light blue line, so even if people have very strong election conspiracy beliefs, the effect, even amongst those who have even if they have high election conspiracy beliefs, if they have low legal cynicism, so if they think it's not okay to break the rules and norms, then we see, and that because that bottom blue line wasn't statistically significant, so we could see that election conspiracy theories did not have any effect on violent intentions anymore. So that just shows, so even though people might have very strong conspiracy beliefs, if they have on top of that also like that high law-related morality, which Noemi Buana would call it, and they say like, no, it's not okay to break the rules and norms, then there's no effect anymore. However, we see if people have election conspiracy beliefs and they think it's okay to break the rules and norms, then we have an extremely strong effect. And we see that their likelihood of engaging in election violence is significantly increased. And a very similar finding, here we just looked at whether people are exposed to extremist settings. So that's a scale developed by Kate and Clemo, and it's also based on Noemi Buana's research on like extremist settings. So here we asked people whether they are exposed to different types of extremist settings on and offline. And we could see that those people, sorry, is a bit squished, the plot. So we could see that when people are exposed to extremist settings in their environment, so that could be people, places, materials, then they have like an extremely high likelihood to also say, yes, I would be willing to engage in election violence. However, the bottom line wasn't statistically significant. So if they're not exposed to any extremism, then we don't see any risk towards violent extremism or election violence. So that just shows again that it's not just, because this is, you could call like an exposure level factor. So it's not just the individual level factor, whether you have the attitude, whether you think the conspiracy theory is real or not. It's also what are you exposed to in your environment, which really plays a role. And then just very quickly, because what we're doing now, when we are just having our third wave scheduled for next week, right after the election. So we're looking now at the trajectory. So far, we've got 2 big waves. We're going to do 6 in total to track the development over time. It depends if we receive further funding for the next few years, which is quite likely. Then we continue with our panel. But what we're really trying to do is now to see how do they evolve over time. Do we see a spike in certain conspiracy theories right after the election? So for example, what we saw last time with data in the US showed that so before Democrats and Republicans thought that election fraud was relatively likely, it was higher amongst Republicans, but Democrats also thought, yes, it's going to happen. However, then when we saw that the Democrats won, suddenly the numbers massively dropped amongst the Democrats, but they heavily increased amongst the Republicans. So that's very interesting for us to see whether certain things increase or decrease. But it's not just whether certain conspiracy theories increase or decrease, but also to look at the same time to people's intentions to engage in different types of violent extremist behaviors and election violence increase or decrease. So despite it being a longitudinal data set, and usually we say, oh, we need longitudinal data to prove any causality. I mean, that type of data, we cannot prove causality. However, we can see whether certain things kind of co-occur or co-develop over time. So do we see a spike in certain types of increase in conspiracy beliefs at the same time as we see increases in violent intentions? Or are there certain groups of people where we see certain increases? And that also then, because we're measuring a host of different risk and protective factors at the same time, that kind of allows us to do that profile modeling. So what types of maybe underlying risk or potentially absent protective factors cause spikes amongst like certain people in, for example, conspiracy beliefs and violent extremism? I said here on the slide what causes these changes. We cannot say really what causes these changes, but we can at least say kind of what co-develops and what is at the time associated with other increases or decreases. And we just think that is very important. Is while we still cannot prove what causes what, it does give us a lot more option and to support like certain types of intervention and prevention strategies, because we have that kind of temporal effect where we see certain things have gotten worse, other things got better, what might have caused it. So yeah, we are aiming to, so these findings will be are twofold, like the implications. So it's first for intervention programs, but also prevention programs. And then it's also geared towards helping risk assessments or structured professional judgment tools to provide that empirical evidence base to also show like not just a cross-sectional relationship, but a relationship over time, and really to help people make like a kind of a more holistic assessment of different types of risk assessment. So yeah, I mean, I'm very excited to come back next year and hopefully can present you the full 6 waves. As I said, we have next week the next wave. Here at NSIDE, we are aiming to publish a week later already our report for the 3 waves, and also depending on how the election goes, different types of associations with potential election violence. So yeah, stay tuned. It should be up on the website of NSIDE and on Twitter. But yeah, just happy to share it with the bird as well. Yeah, and also just to say, Paul, he can't be here, but we're leading the project together. So if you have any questions, you can always email us, or yeah, we're also on X, it's called now. So yeah, if you have any questions, just yeah, feel free to ask me, and thank you very much.